Trump had enough resources at any time, you couldn't knock him out. But in addition, Trump did something I couldn't have done that is, I look back on it as one of the great acts of genius in American politics, comparable to FDR inventing the fireside chat. Trump, what nobody in this city understands, this is part of why I wrote Understanding Trump, what nobody in this city understands is Donald J. Trump had a primetime television show for 13 years. It was the top show in the country for 4 years. Now, because it wasn't on PBS and because it didn't follow Downton Abbey, nobody in this city understood that. Nobody in this city said the day he announced, a guy who knows television that well is by definition formidable. And what Trump had learned, and he writes about this in The Art of the Deal pretty decisively, so what Trump had learned in New York in the 80s was that any publicity which printed your name correctly built strength. And so he was happy, and this is part of it, and I actually think he should modify what he's doing in terms of the tweets and all that, because I've told him, I think 10% less Trump would be 100% more effective. But he had figured out early on that if he could engage the media, that the hunger of the 24-hour-a-day cable news system and the power of Facebook and Twitter meant that he could just take all the air out of the room. So all these other guys are running around raising money in order to be able to buy TV ads to be on television. You know, Trump would get up in the morning, he would tweet, that would then set up his argument with Morning Joe. He'd call into Morning Joe, who would always take his call, and they'd argue for 25 minutes. Then he would call in to Fox and Friends, and they would have a love fest for 25 minutes. Then he would have breakfast. I mean, he's already generated, you know. And so all morning the media is covering the argument that Trump's in the middle of. Then about 10 in the morning he would do a press event to keep the momentum up. And then about 10 in the evening he would do an hour on Hannity for free. So in the course of a normal Trumpian day, he's at about $1 million free media. Meanwhile, all of his competitors are off the air, running around the country trying to raise money to be able to get on the air. And what was happening was just this sheer name ID. You know, there's only one poll in the entire campaign where Trump's not ahead for the nomination. People tend to forget this. He was the front runner from the day he announced, except for one poll where Dr. Carson pulled ahead. And yet nobody in the elite media could say to themselves, and Silver's an interesting example, nobody in the elite media could say to themselves, if he's the front runner every single poll, could it be he's the front runner? Because everybody in the Washington elite knew he couldn't be the front runner because then everything they believed in would be crazy, and since they couldn't be crazy, he had to be crazy, and if he was crazy, he couldn't be the front runner, even though he was the front runner. I mean, this went on, and so I'm in a situation where I'm watching these so-called experts, who, by the way, have learned nothing. I mean, the stuff you get on TV today is as stupid and as wrong as the people who laughed when he announced, the people who laughed in the primaries, the people who laughed at the convention, the people who laughed in the general election. They haven't learned anything because they can't, because it's a repudiation of their own life. So their choice is, I can believe in a fantasy which at least validates me, or I can decide the world has really changed dramatically and that invalidates me. I pick the fantasy. And that's literally where we are right now, which dramatically, it'll be interesting to see how the dance continues for the next 3 years, because I think gradually Trump will figure out an angle to break out of all this in a way that will be historic.
So it's still happening. You're saying that people haven't learned from the campaign.
I mean, look at the whole Russian fantasy. You know, what happened election night was the Democrats said Hillary can't have lost. And certainly Donald Trump can't have won. So somebody cheated. I wonder, Putin cheated. Do you realize this is all Putin's fault? And that means that there must have been collusion. Do you realize that they must have colluded? And so for the last 6 months, everybody on the left has been just walking around town chanting, watch for the Russian connection, watch for the Russian connection, look for the collusion. Turns out, even Dianne Feinstein, the ranking Democrat on the Intelligence Committee, says there is zero evidence of collusion. So now the newest one is, but there was obstruction of justice over the collusion. So the fantasy that didn't occur is now being replaced by the way, technically, the President of the United States cannot obstruct justice. The President of the United States is the chief executive officer of the United States. If he wants to fire the FBI director, all he's going to do is fire him. And somebody said the other day, I thought it was a very good test. If John F. Kennedy had fired J. Edgar Hoover over investigating and wiretapping Martin Luther King Jr., would people have thought that it was obstruction? So there's not really collusion. So what's the latest leak to the Washington Post, whose record, by the way, of running anonymous leaks is actually beaten the New York Times. It's an enormous achievement, and I give the Post credit that in their energy and enthusiasm, they have been even more consistently wrong than the Times, which is actually in the Olympics of stupidity, an enormous, enormous challenge. So the latest thing is Mueller, who will not be able to get anything on Russia and will not be able to get anything on obstruction, is now going to look at finances. And what you're seeing, of course, is this is why when I was Speaker, I opposed renewing the Independent Counsel Act, because what happens is you bring in a whole bunch of high-priced lawyers, they give up their regular career, they're going to look for a scalp, they're going to find somebody, and the Fitzgerald case where Comey brought in the godfather to his children, Fitzgerald, in order to appoint him a special counsel when they knew there was no crime, because in fact Valerie Plame had already been, was no longer a protected name at the CIA, and they knew who had done it. Richard Armitage had leaked it. And they still appointed an independent counsel who promptly decided his mission was to get Dick Cheney. I mean, it is the most grotesque example of a miscarriage of justice and the danger of the power of the government. You go back and look at that case. That's why I am very worried about Mueller. It's not that Mueller's a bad person. Mueller's a patriot. Mueller's a guy who served with great distinction in Vietnam. Mueller, I have no doubt that he is a person who is going to do his best. But he is surrounding himself with a collective group of people who are going to engage in a witch hunt. And I encourage everybody to actually read Arthur Miller's The Crucible, which is about the witchcraft trials in the late 17th century in Salem. And understand that's the mentality of the left right now. The left right now is engaged in the Salem witchcraft process of, we know somebody's evil, we know somebody's bad, I wonder who we should burn at the stake. Maybe it's you, whoever you are.